All right, we are back for the final section of chapter 12, which is section 5. It's going to be talking about the kingdoms of Southeast Asia and also a little bit about Korea. So Roman numeral 1 begins with talking about those kingdoms that existed in Southeast Asia. And so we'll talk a little bit about geography there. When we talk about Southeast Asia, it includes the modern day countries of Myanmar, which is also known as Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Brunei, and also the Philippines. Now, there are two definite partitions in this group. First of all, there's Indochina, which is the portion of Southeast Asia that actually touches mainland China. And then there are the surrounding islands, which are totally surrounded by, of course, the sea in that region. Now, point number 3 states that due to the proximity of the sea, control of trade routes in this region was extremely important. I'm going to show you a map geographically here so you kind of understand what we're talking about. This is basically China at the time, all of this region here. This is Korea, so we'll talk about them at the end of the lesson. But Southeast Asia is this region right here. Vietnam, okay, the Khmer Empire, which is in Cambodia. Down here, the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, so on and so forth. This is the region that we're talking about when we're referring to Southeast Asia, down in this region here, okay? All right, now, we'll talk about, because of the mainland influence of India and China, there's a lot of cultural similarities. Indian merchant ships actually began to sail to these regions in the early AD period. Hindu and Buddhist missionaries also began to spread their faith in this region as well. Indian influences were there, and they remain evident in the ideas of religion, language, and also art to this day. China also influenced the region through trade, and at times, actually, China controlled a lot of these regions directly by conquering and overtaking them. However, an example of an independent kingdom / empire was the Khmer Empire, and that was located in modern-day Cambodia. It was the main power of Southeast Asian mainland. They built irrigation systems and waterways, which allowed for actually about 3 to 4 cultivations of rice per year. That exceeds the general one in the region, so that's pretty impressive. They built their capital city at a place called Angkor. In the city, rulers created and constructed temple complexes that were very large and significant. One was called Ankgor Wat. It's a temple complex that is one of the world's greatest architectural achievements. It was dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, and it covers nearly 1 square mile. It's a complex that's about 1 square mile large. That's huge. It was built in the 1100s. It is the world's largest religious structure, and I'll show you a picture of it. It's on page 345. This is only one part of it. This is probably like the most popular view of Angkor Wat, but it's much larger than that. And that city was located right here in the center of the Khmer Empire right there. So that's Angkor Wat. I would encourage you to do a little bit of research. You probably have never heard of it before, but it's actually absolutely massive, and it's a fairly impressive sight to see. Okay, next we'll go to capital D. We'll talk about outside of the mainland components. We'll talk about some of the island kingdoms. So powerful kingdoms also developed on those islands that I was showing you throughout Southeast Asia. A kingdom called Selendra was an agricultural-based kingdom located on the island of Java. The kings there built another impressive temple for their faith of Buddhism. The temple is called Borobudur, and I will show you one picture of it. That's this one right here. Here's Borobudur, the city of that. It has 92 statues of the Buddha on its very top level there. And that's located down here on the island of Java. Right there is Borobudur. Okay. All right. Now, we'll take a look at where we left off. Selendra was eventually taken over by another island empire called Srivijaya. They controlled the trade and waterways such as the Strait of Malacca in and around the islands of Sumatra, Borneo, and also Java. Their capital was set at a place called Palembang on the island of Sumatra. It became a center of Buddhist learning where Chinese monks would actually come and study and live and learn instead of traveling all the way to India, which was a little bit tougher because of the mountain ranges that separate those regions. Srivijaya became powerful and wealthy by actually taxing outside ships that traveled through the waterways that they controlled. Pretty smart. It's kind of like a modern day turnpike system where, like, hey, if you want to travel on the roads in Ohio, some of the good roads that are taken really well care of are, called the turnpikes, and you got to pay a fee every so often to travel those roads. So it was similar to that. It was sort of a tax that they placed on people coming into their waterways. Capital E talks about what today we know as Vietnam, but Da Viet. It was the region of Vietnam. It had fallen under control of China around 100 BC, which was the Han Dynasty. However, the Vietnam region actually gained independence from another dynasty called the Tang that we've learned about around 900 AD. At that point, it became an independent kingdom known as Da Viet, and this happens in 939 officially. The Lý Dynasty, which occurred from 1009 all the way to 1225, was the power at that point. They were located in the capital city of Hanoi on the Red River Delta. The Lý Dynasty was actually very influential to the development of Vietnamese government, agriculture, transportation, and also trade. So a little bit of Chinese influence, a little bit of influence on their own, and so that's how you get Vietnam today. Okay, so still in this chapter, we're going to take a look at Korean dynasties. We'll talk briefly about Korea. Geography. Korea is a peninsula. It was connected to China and is also located quite near to Japan. It is very mountainous, and so therefore it developed into semi-isolated states, kind of like how the Greek city-states originally came about. That's sort of similar to what happened with early Korea. Some of the early history of Korea is that it was much controlled by clans, which is very similar to Japan early on. The Han Dynasty of China actually controlled Korea in 108 BC and therefore influenced the Korean history and development. But during the time that the Han ruled, there were actually three rival kingdoms or federations, you could call them, that emerged underneath the Han rule. In the 600s, which was much later, a kingdom called Silla defeated the others, also drove out the Chinese, and took control of the entire Korean peninsula. Under the Silla control, the Koreans built Buddhist monasteries and elaborated stone and bronze sculptures. A bit later, which would be by the end of the 900s, a new dynasty called the Koryu Dynasty came in place as the Silla declined. Around 935, in fact, a new dynasty emerged under control of a rebel leader named Wang Khan, who became the king. The Koryu Dynasty lasted from 935 to 1395, so a pretty long-lasting dynasty. And they modeled their government off of China's, actually. They had a lot of similar practices, including the civil service examinations. The big difference, though, between China and Korea is that in Korea, they didn't really use the exam to end the big wealth gap and the big separation of nobles and merchants and commoners. In Korea, there was still a large separation between nobles and commoners. Rich nobles had a much better chance of getting the best positions as it became sort of somewhat hereditary. If your dad held a high position in government, you were kind of penciled in as being the next key leader in that position. And so it kind of stamped out people who couldn't either afford to get educated or had no, what we call hereditary rights to those positions. The Mongols actually attacked Korea in 1231. They defeated the Koreans and forced them to pay extremely high tribute. Slaves, tools, weapons, agricultural goods, all of those things, they were heavily expected to be paid by the Koreans to the Mongols. And the Mongols ruled Korea all the way into the 1360s, which is about the time that they went out of power as well. In 1392, a group of scholar officials actually overthrew the remaining Koryu dynasty, and a new dynasty called the Choson or Yi dynasty emerged. One point that's in the text that I didn't mention here is that during the Koryu dynasty's rule, which was still while the Mongols were in power, the Mongols destroyed some really important block printing designs and templates that were meant to recreate over and over Buddhist scripts and teachings. And so there were like 80 block printing, large blocks that were destroyed. And then eventually they were rebuilt. And it's kind of a big cultural practice to celebrate that those are still around, and the rebuilt ones are housed in museums throughout this region as well. So that is the end of chapter 12 and section 5. I'll take you to one last point here. which shows you where Korea is located today. There are two Koreas. It says, since the end of World War II, Korea has arbitrarily divided into two countries. You have communist North Korea and democratic South Korea. For years, many Koreans longed for their country to be reunited. Hopes of such a day rose in 2000 when the presidents of the two nations sat down to discuss reunification. In 2002, however, North Korea announced that it was developing nuclear weapons and would use them against South Korea if necessary. This greatly dimmed people's hopes for one Korea. And as we know today, we still have a lot of animosity with North Korea, and they make threats against the United States. They make threats against South Korea. They test military weapons a lot, and those are some of the things that you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about the separation of the Koreas and its history there. Actually, I misspoke. I said 80 blocks. There are actually 80,000 blocks that were destroyed and then recreated in that block printing scheme. So I do apologize there. It's 80,000 blocks, which makes that an even greater story.